Hey everybody. So I'm in like literal tears here. I just watched uh one of the typing videos on talking with famous people. And I encourage everybody, if you haven't seen it yet, go watch the typing video with Nicholas um from a few days ago. And spoiler alert, he, he comes out as TE Polar. Um, and he's just got one of the best examples of TE Polar. And it has all the hallmarks of what we typically point out. I mean, number one, he's just surprised that he's even being asked to do the TE task. Number two, he goes in the classic TE polar mode, which I'll get into in a second, but the classic mode of like, okay, well, I have to make sure I've got all the stuff first, right? Um, and you see it in so many, I mean, you see it in so many examples, including, my testing session where I was asked to build a balloon and I was like, well, we got to go buy this stuff. And then number three, the just relying on somebody else to tell you how to do it. It's like, he gets all his stuff and he's ready, to complete the task, and then like literally the entire task, like he encapsulates it all by saying, okay, and then I'll watch a YouTube video that tells me how to do it, and I'll just do what they tell me to do. And I said the same thing, pretty much that, well, I'll go find a YouTube video or I'll find an expert that will tell me how to do this thing. So classic, so, or as they say, textbook case of TE Polar. It's just so great. I put a link in the video in the description below. Obviously, I encourage you to watch the whole thing. It's a uh, great example of a lot of the different functions. And I'm going to go back and break down a few more things that I noticed, that especially, well, I've sort of given it away with the FE as a tool function. There's a lot of cool stuff there too, but the TE Polar stuff is just so great. It starts around the 47-minute mark. So, if you want to skip to it, feel free. But again, I encourage you to watch the whole video. But one thing I noticed in the comments to the video uh, was sort of an interesting thing that I wanted to riff on for a second here. And this is sort of an immediate reaction video, so I haven't really thought this through yet. But it's sort of consistent with things I've talked about in the past, and so I'm going to riff on it, and then I might do more of a sort of formal follow-up video later on it after I've had a chance to digest it all. But okay, so the commenters were Eric made a point when he was in the video and he was sort of explaining the the TE polar results, and he made a comment about how people who are TE polar are going to be knowing types. Either you're going to have lead introverted sensing or lead introverted intuition, and so there's a sort of need to know what's going on. But the commenters made a good point of, yeah, but that doesn't explain why an ISTJ or an INTJ, who are also presumably knowing types, don't make the same mistakes. Or at least at least not to that extent. They might have little quirky things. They might want to ask for some clarification on something, but they don't just fall off the cliff like those of us who are TE polar are. And I think there's another component to it. And it goes to my take on what is sort of the fundamental difference between TE and FE as far as like kind of a computational or processing perspective, where And go back if you're sort of curious about what I'm getting into. I explain it more in a video that's titled something like "Foxes, Rabbits, and Extroverted Feeling," something like that. Where I talk about how extroverted feeling is really a non-linear function, um, or it's a non-linear processing unit, um, because it's dealing with social interactions. And somehow, through biology, evolution, our brain adapted two different ways of engaging with the world. And I argue there's a linear system and there's a nonlinear system. And the linear system is more of your TE stuff, just very ordinal, very linear, because TE stuff like objects, places, physical space, dealing with, physical objects that aren't people, usually don't change over time. And so once you sort of figure out the system with your TE, you can rely on the fact that that's just going to sort of stay the same. It's going to, and even if you're encountering a new situation where you really have to use your TE, you can rely on um, you don't need to rely so much on feedback from the world, in like a dynamic way. You can sort of expect things are going to happen in an ordinal, expected way, right? They're going to follow the laws of physics, right, and cause and effect. Where when you're dealing with people, you can't expect them to act linearly. You can't expect, even if you're dealing with the same person on day one and then day two, they might react very differently depending on their mood, depending on the context, depending on who else is around, um, depending on lots of variables. And so you have this, what I would call a nonlinear system that relies on feedback loops. Okay. And it's constantly sort of updating, okay, where am I in this situation, right? It's reading the situation and then figuring out the appropriate response. Okay. And because we're sort of social animals and we sort of evolved to be social animals, we had to evolve some sort of brain system that can process information that way, because we have to deal with the fact that people and social dynamics change constantly, right? And we can't expect people to always act the same. We can't expect Sally to act like Bobby. Different people are going to act differently. The same person, again, might act differently depending on the context. And so we're constantly updating, these feedback loops, right? In a way that you don't have to do as much. You do it a little, of course, but you don't have to do it as much when you're using TE and you're just trying to figure out, like, how do I fix my refrigerator, or how do I cut my hair, or how do I take out the trash, because the world by and large stays pretty consistent, right? And even if it's a new task, you don't expect there to be like all these dynamics that you have to deal with in the same way that you do when you're dealing with social type things. And so why do you see this breakdown in TE? And my best guess, and of course, this is just me saying this, but my reaction to this is just that when you're TE polar and you don't take things as a given, right? When you're using FE as a tool function, so you're an ISFJ or an INFJ, you're constantly thinking of the world as this dynamic, constantly shifting environment where nothing is really a given. Like there's no starting point that sort of, again, that we can take as a given. We have to know, okay, what are the conditions of the environment? Because I don't know where to go with this process unless I know what the conditions are, because we're always thinking that things are changing. We don't take things as a given in the way that people who will use TE, your INTJs, your ISTJs as a tool function, are probably more likely to just sort of assume a condition, assume a starting point, right? Because they're much more comfortable in dealing with a linear environment where you just sort of know what the condition is, what the state of the world is. Where again, FE users, we don't assume that. We're constantly trying to, just because our FE is this tool function, it's constantly just trying to figure out, okay, what state are we in in the world? Um, because we're used to dealing with sort of social things. Okay. So I guess a good analogy, I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not, so I apologize. But I guess a good analogy would be, think of, just sort of imagine in your mind's eye that you sit down with a friend to play a game of chess. What does it look? What does the table that you just sat down, like? What does the environment look like? My hunch is if you're an FE user, you're not entirely sure. Is the chessboard set up? Are all the pieces where they're supposed to be? Or are they scattered around? Or are they still in the box? All that kind of stuff. We don't take the starting position as a given. People who probably use TE probably have a pretty good idea, like, oh, I'm guessing here, but I would imagine that they sort of think of, okay, the chessboard's set up, now we're going to start playing. They're not thinking of like, oh, well, maybe the pieces are in the box, maybe the pieces are still scattered around from the last game we just finished, blah, 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 blah. Now, where they're starting, it's not that they necessarily always start in the same place. Every TE user might start in a different place, but they're pretty confident with where they're starting. Where an FE user is probably thinking like, okay, well, it could be one of three possibilities or one of four possibilities. So it could be this, it could be that, it could be this. And so when we're imagining in our mind's eye, we're flipping back and forth between those possibilities, right? Where a T user probably thinks of, okay, we're starting at this state, that's where we are, right? And I don't, I again, this is just my hunch. I'm no backing whatsoever, any evidence, but it's just the way I think of it. This is just an analogy where they just sort of assume, okay, either the pieces are in the box, fine, we'll start there. Pieces are already set up on the board, fine, we'll start there. But they're not sort of shifting between different possible states of where they're starting in their mind's eye, where somebody with an FE tool function, I would argue, does. Okay. And so when we're presented, those of us who are TE POLR, are presented with this, like, how do you prepare chips in salsa? How do you cut your hair? Like, we don't know what the starting condition is, right? We don't know what the state of the world is when we start. And so we sort of have to figure this out, right? Looks like I got a comment here. If FEX moves naturally with any checks people and updates. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So it looks like Eric, or somebody who hacked into his account, said FEX most naturally with any and checks people and updates. I would definitely agree with that. Probably FE and I mean FE and any. Did you mean NI or do you really mean NE? TEX moves naturally with SE in action, checks and updates. Yeah. Okay. So assuming you are talking about the extroverted action functions, yeah, definitely. So even though NE is going to be quote unquote unconscious or backstack for an INFJ, you probably are using them interchangeably, where FE is sort of planning like, okay, given this state of the world, this is what I'm going to do. But the NE is sort of figuring out, like, okay, here are the possible ways this scenario is going to roll out. Um, yeah. Right. Um, and yeah, in TE and SE, again, because I think of TE as linear, and so it's probably more locked into the physical world, right? And SE is going to be more locked into the physical world. So, a heavy TE SE user is going to be very locked in to what's going on, um, in a very linear way, in a very cause effect kind of way. And then an FE and NE are going to be more flexible, right? Like, how could this scenario play out? And so, yeah, I guess like your ENTPs and INTPs, when interacting with people, are definitely going to see more possibilities. But I also think it extends more, not just to social situations, but things, any sort of non-linear system like the stock market or the economy, things like that, where you don't really know what's going to happen, and it all depends on what state you're in right now and what the conditions are. And so that's why I think INFJs make really good lawyers. They make good economists because they could think of these sort of different possibilities in a non-linear way, and they don't get sort of stuck in the traditional formula. Okay, more comments here. Let's see here. Right. Yeah, yeah. No, I would agree. I would definitely agree with the idea of an FE user are more gift givers, in the sense that, but this is sort of getting into maybe a totally different topic. But as an INFJ, I'm a big gift giver. I'm also a Leo, so big gift giver. But it is sort of this sort of concrete way of expressing FE. Um, and and probably picking up on more sort of SE type social cues, like status symbols, things like that. Where is somebody sitting in the room? What kind of car are they driving? Sort of making those sort of FE, or using SE information to make sort of FE decisions, right? How do I interact with this person? And I'm going to, sort of read into the SE information. And of course, using the NI to, sort of ascribe some sort of meaning to it. Where, yeah, the NE, your ENTPs, INTPs are probably more likely to sort of wing it and make inappropriate comments, and just put it out there. Let's see how they'll react to this comment about, dead kittens or something like that. Um, and sort of wing it and maybe not read off of the SE grounded sort of cues. Let's see here. TE lawyers will just work the process. Oh yeah, this is the story of my life. I could do a whole video on this, but I don't want to get in trouble. But TE lawyers will just work the process, file all the various things at the right time. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, body language too with the SE, definitely. Um, and yeah, on the lawyer thing, I mean, all types can make good lawyers. Even the TI polar types, they're very good at client development. um, and you just have to find. This is why I think MBTI and all this cognitive function stuff is so useful, because you have to find the right type of area. So INFJs do really well in sort of regulatory stuff like tax, securities laws, hospitals, health regulations, stuff like that. Very regulated stuff where you have to know not just what the rules are, but why the rules are. Like what's the spirit behind it? What are they trying to accomplish? And it makes knowing the rules that much easier, right? So you're using that NI to be like, okay, there's this crazy tax rule with all these rules and then all these exceptions to the rules. But if you sort of look at it and you understand what they're trying to accomplish, then all those rules and all the exceptions sort of make sense, right? The TE type lawyers, they just know that there's these rules, right? And there's some possible exceptions to the rules. And, especially if they're sort of SI users, they'll just sort of go with, here's how we always do it. Here's how everybody else does it, right? And then if a client pushes back and says, well, why? Why do we have to do it that way? That's when they call the INFJs or the INTJs or anybody with NI that could sort of explain that to them. But you need all, again, you need all the personalities to sort of cover the spectrum. All right, what else is going on here? Let's see here. Sorry, there's a lot here. I got to go back. Yeah, okay. So the comment on is TE stuff just as dynamic. I guess. I mean, there's definitely going to be cause and effect, right? I mean, like if you unscrew this screw and take out this widget and put that widget back, yes, there's cause and effect things. I guess my point is that there's not a whole lot of degrees of freedom, right? It's going to be a very constrained universe. Unless you're out in space or something where there's no gravity, what the effects of your actions are probably going to be in a TE type of scenario. So when I'm talking about dynamic, maybe that's just the wrong word, but because there is, some engagement, there's some back and forth, things change over time. It's just that it's a more predictable, less variable change. Where when you're dealing with people, you don't know, right? But if you're a heavy NIFE user, you have a pretty good guess. I mean, the degrees of freedom, you can sort of guess what the degrees of freedom are going to be, right? What the possible outcomes might be, or what if you're an NI user, what you would expect it to be, right? But you have to sort of go with the flow more, right? You have to be more adaptive to feedback loops than you do in SETE world, I would argue. Okay. Yeah, no, I would agree. Especially on your comment about comparing INFJs to ISFJs or ESFJs. Yeah. Because the ESFJs and ESFJs and ISFJs, yeah, I mean, they're going to be much more of your process types, I think. It does. I mean, the ESFJs are also using FE in a dynamic way. Maybe again, dynamic might be the wrong word, um, but I'll come back to that. I need to think. I gotta let this filter through down to my TI to really give this a good response. But I'll come. There is something different, I think, between like a lead FE user and a secondary FE user. And I haven't completely hashed it out, but they just seem different to me. In the way that this sort of nonlinear phenomenon emerges. But okay, cool. Yeah, no, I think we're on the same page here. So the comment, it's just that possible human reactions to things are few and universal. The dynamism in TE is that each thing has its own logic and TE is figuring it out. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think TE is figuring out, how does the motherboard work or the circuit board or the engine or whatever you're dealing with, or this, financial system, or, paperwork, or whatever you're dealing with in the TE world. And yes, it has its own logic. I guess my argument is just that it doesn't tend to change, right? Like once you sort of figure out how an engine works, you know how an engine works, or you know what to expect. When you start tinkering with it, the range of possibilities is somewhat limited, and doesn't necessarily make it more simple. I mean, to me, it's super complicated. It's just that it allows your brain to think of it linearly, right? And if you think of it like the really heavy TE users, like the real pushy ENTJs or ESTJs, they think of everything as very linear, just, as a given, right? That, the whole world has to change before, they're going to change their process or their way of doing things. Where, the FE users are probably a little bit more flexible in that kind of stuff. We see things as constantly changing. And it's almost weird to us that you have this whole section of the world that acts linearly, where you can just sort of take things, as being true, or consistent. I don't know. Anyways, thanks for stopping by. If what makes me about tick, T is figuring out. Yeah. So FE is figuring out what makes Mary and Bob tick. And TE is figuring out how machine works. Yeah, definitely. Or process or spatial layout, or anything that's just linear and sort of consistent. I keep wanting to say non-dynamic, but I don't want to get caught up on terms here. Get that I'm coming across super pedantic. Well, that's why we're all here, Eric. We all want to be super pedantic. No, not at all. Trust me. Yeah, no, I think we're just sort of hashing out defined terms here, in a very TI kind of way, right? And yeah, definitely appreciate it. By the way, I don't know if you saw, but this all stemmed from your typing video with Nicholas in the classic TE polar response. Just a great example. And it's so consistent with just all the other examples of just, where am I? What am I doing? And as soon as you see that, yeah, that's TE polar. How can I be sure in a world that's constantly changing? You don't know that song. No, but it does make me think of the Talking Heads, like, this isn't my beautiful wife. This isn't my beautiful house. Okay. All right. I'm going to run. Thanks for stopping by, Eric. It's always a pleasure. I'm probably going to do a more sort of in-depth analysis on that video with Nicholas, as long as you're cool with it. Because there are interesting FE tool things where I'm going to give a sneak preview here, where he's talking about how he felt bad that he hadn't really been talking to his family or his friends that he had left behind at home. And to me, that is just so FE tool, where like he doesn't really need them right now. He doesn't need that social interaction right now, and he's just sort of waiting for a time where he needs to interact with them, or has. I don't want to come across as crude, or like that he's uncaring or anything, but it's just, to me, it's just a good example of an FE tool user, where it's like, yeah, these people are important to me and they'll always be important to me, but I don't really need them right now. But when I do need them, I'll get back to them. Old 60s song. Yeah. Cool. All right, cool. Have a good night, man. Take care. Thanks for stopping by. Bye, everybody.